Okay, why don't we get started? For a little bit of a housekeeping, while I put this poll in front of you, just to give me an idea how you're doing in terms of your usage of Sumo Logic. You can take a couple of seconds and just vote here. But as you probably noticed, a couple of housekeeping things. You're muted. If you have any questions, feel free to send questions through the GoToWebinar questions panel. I'll be gathering questions as we go. I'll try to answer them, but if I have any questions, we'll have some time at the end as well. So if you don't mind, just take a few minutes, or a few seconds, I should say, and answer this quick poll. That'd be great for helping me understand where you guys are. And if you haven't seen the name at the bottom right-hand side, my name is Mario Sanchez. Actually, when I share the screen, you'll see it. I run training here at Sumo Logic. And my email, if you have any questions that you want to follow up, is mario@sumologic.com, or you can always email training@sumologic.com as well. All right, let me turn this off, close that poll, and just share those results with you. It looks like about 50% of you are brand spanking new to Sumo Logic, and a few of you have run some searches. So this is what I expected. This is the kind of profile of folks that attend this session. So with that said, we're going to start with not necessarily 30,000-foot view. There's a couple of other webinars that happened before this one. And with that said, actually, let me just make sure that you guys are aware of those. I believe I recognize some names from previous webinars, but you know that there's 3 webinars. There's a Sumo Logic Quick Start, which is just getting an intro to what are the capabilities of Sumo Logic. There's another one called Using Sumo Logic, which deals more into the analytics. How can I use Sumo Logic to analyze my data? What we're doing today is setting up. This is more about how do I get data into Sumo Logic, and what are the things that I do as an administrator to keep my system humming so that others can use it. So if you haven't attended these other ones, especially the Using Sumo Logic, I highly encourage you to do so. That one's happening, I believe, next week. Yes, August 23rd and 24th. So when you get a chance, you should definitely join that, or watch the recording of the previous webinar as well. I believe I mentioned yesterday or the day before when I ran this one, but there is certification as well. For this webinar that we're running today, there is no certification just yet. This is for the Superpower Admin. It should be up and coming in the near future. But if you have taken level 1 or level 2, you will receive notification when level 3 is available. So you can try that one as well. Okay, so with that said, let's jump into what we're covering in this webinar. So the idea is that at the completion of this webinar, you're going to be able to deploy a data collection that is meaningful to your environment. I'm going to talk about different options. I'm going to talk about best practices, but at the end of the day, what really matters is what you have in your environment. And we're going to talk about the different options and what are the best practices around that in terms of getting the data into Sumo. We're going to talk about a good naming convention for your metadata. Metadata is how you tag your data as it's coming into Sumo, and coming up with a robust naming convention is going to make a big difference for you, especially as you start adding more and more data in your system. And then I'm going to talk about, the last part I'm going to talk about is optimization tools. How can you make your search performance a lot better for your users, again, especially as you start growing and you start getting more data. Perhaps it's nothing that you need right away, but certainly something that you're going to start looking into as your environment grows. Okay, I won't go through this demo because I've ran it through the previous sessions, and I think a few of you have already attended those sessions. But in short, the idea with a unified logs and metrics solution is that you have the ability to get notifications, whether it's a dashboard or an alert, get some sort of notification of a critical event, go into some dashboards and start identifying what is going on in your environment. In this case, we're using metrics to identify that there's something wrong. For example, in the demo that I ran a couple of days ago, we see the fact that people cannot book their travel with our website. They cannot book their cars or their hotels or their airfares. And so that's the metric. It's telling me what is going on in the system. But the interesting thing is correlating those metrics to the logs. How do I go to the relevant logs and identify why this is happening? What's the cause of what's going on? Because that cause is what's really going to allow me to take action and fix those metrics, which eventually take care of those critical events that I've been notified. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you watch previous webinars. There's a good demo of how this is, of the end game of what you want to eventually have as you're creating, as you're setting up Sumo. But started with a 30,000-foot view, since a few of you said that you're brand spanking new to Sumo. Sumo's broken into three areas, if you will. There's a data collection, and this is where we're going to focus on today. Most of our time, or 100% of our time, is going to be here, data collection. Then there is, how do I search and analyze that data? How do I use the operators that exist? How do I detect outliers? How do I detect my trends? So that's the webinar that we're running next week. And then there's another part of, okay, now that I've analyzed my data, how do I start visualizing it? How do I monitor it? How do I get Sumo to work for me? So the end game really is this number 3 here. How do I get Sumo to tell me what's going on so that I don't have to be looking and searching every single time? Like I said, there are webinars for number 2 and number 3, but today we're focusing really on data collection, on number 1. All right, so with that said, and by the way, feel free to send any questions that you have as we go through this. I'm going to talk a little bit about data collection. First things is, we can really collect data from just about anything. You can send us a book if you want to. We'll take that book and we'll index it. You can send us logs that are structured. You can send us unstructured data. These are just examples of kinds of logs that we can take in. Or you notice that we can grab data from your entire stack, starting from your network all the way up to your custom application code, and however you're wanting to send us that data. We can also take data from your infrastructure. So just about anything that you have in text format, you can send it to us, and we can grab that as a log. I'll talk later on about metrics as well, since you've seen that demo. But from a logs perspective, you can send us just about anything. We'll grab that and we'll index that data. So I talked a little bit about this yesterday, or a couple of days ago, about this screen here. It's showing you how we can really get data from just about anything. The collection or receiving data for Sumo Logic is incredibly flexible, which means that because you have so much flexibility, there are so many different ways you can configure things. So you have to think about what is the best way to do it for you. I'm going to talk about the different options, and we'll talk about what's the right deployment for your organization. So if you look at this screen here, picture at the right-hand side, everything at the top of that screenshot is what we call a hosted collector. And by hosted collector, we mean cloud-to-cloud integration. For example, here in the top left, you can have cloud-to-cloud integration from your CloudWatch, from your ELB, from your CloudTrail, everything coming from your AWS services, right, into Sumo Logic. Similarly, you could have cloud-to-cloud log collection from Akamai, for example, CDF and WAF services. You could have cloud-to-cloud log collection from PaaS and SaaS platforms, for example, Google Apps and Office 365, as I'm showing here. So these are cloud-to-cloud integrations. You could do a straight-up HTTPS post. You could use a custom script to do say a curl command and just do a post straight into Sumo, and that would be a cloud-to-cloud log collection. We'll talk about the benefits and the pros and cons about doing cloud collection later on. Down at the bottom, you have examples of what we call an installed collector. This is a small collector that gets installed on your servers. So this example here that I'm circling on the right-hand side would be collectors that get installed on your Unix, on your Windows, on your Ubuntu servers, and those could in turn be sending data over to, through a firewall, be sending data over to Sumo Logic. If you have an environment where you do not have outbound internet access, then this might not be possible. And in that case, this bottom left-hand side might be the better option for you. You have a collector that is a centralized collector, that has access to the internet and over onto Sumo Logic. And then you can have your logs be remotely collected using SSH or WMI. You can send those logs over to the centralized collector and then on to Sumo Logic. And this collector can do double duty and grab your network devices, your firewalls, your routers. It can grab that via syslog onto this collector and then over to Sumo Logic as well. Okay, so I talked about hosted collectors. I talked about installed collectors. Within hosted collectors, it's pretty straightforward, as I mentioned before. It's cloud-to-cloud collection, and there's just one quote-unquote flavor for it. For the installed collectors, we have two flavors, which I kind of alluded already. We have what we call a centralized data collector. That means you have a whole bunch of machines that send data to one collector and then on to Sumo. And then we have a local data collector collection strategy, which is you have multiple collectors in each one of your servers, and those are sending data to Sumo. Neither is better than the other. It all depends on what you have in place. So let me take us some time and talk about the different pros and cons for those. By the way, I will share these slides with you. There is a whole, everything that I'm going to talk about right now, there is a document in our documentation called Best Practices on Designing Your Deployment, and that talks about memory size and all that good stuff, all the nitty-gritty information. You can go into any of these documents and you'll get a lot of this information as well. All right, so a couple things to keep in mind as you're thinking about collectors and as you're thinking about installed collectors in particular. So hosted collectors are pretty straightforward, cloud to cloud. But if you're going to install collectors and you're trying to figure out which options I should go in here, consider having an installed collector on a dedicated machine. So consider having your install collector dedicated machine if you're going to be running very high bandwidth network with high logging levels. So if you're considering high logging levels, very high bandwidth, dedicated machine with a collector is your better option. You also, if you want a central collection point for many sources, then this is the way to go, right? Later on I'll talk a little bit more about this, but if you already have a centralized login infrastructure, let's say you're using Logstash or something similar, then a dedicated, using this centralized data collection is a good option. We will not recommend that you go and set up this centralized data collection only for logging, just from a Sumo perspective. And the reason for that is because it does require a lot of resources. You have to have someone to now man this new centralized data collection environment that you have. You have to set up some rules and all that good stuff. So again, like I'm saying, it depends on the environment you have in place, whether you can take advantage of things that you already have. All right. You would want to consider having more than one installed collector if any of the following is in place. For one, as you expect a combined number of files coming into that collector or into one of the collectors to exceed 500 number of files. If your hardware has memory or CPU limitations, then you would want to separate the load into the collectors themselves. If you expect logging traffic to be higher than 15,000 events per second, then perhaps you want to have more than one installed collector, right? If your network clusters or regions are geographically separated, then you probably want to have collectors in those different geographical regions as well. And also, if you prefer to install many collectors, for example, in this case, we're talking about one per machine to collect the local files. So these are just some of the things to consider. But now let me talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each one of them. And again, as you see, we're pointing to system requirements for all this stuff as well. So I won't go through it because it's a lot of time to go through them, but all the detail is there. All right. So if you have a local data collection, remember that means I have. Let me just go back. That means this scenario. I have a collector installed per each one of these machines. So if you have a local data collection, what are the source types that you're gathering? You're pulling up local files, let's say your OS, your middleware, any custom apps that you might have. You might be pulling window events, Docker, syslog, or you could have a script that is just pulling cloud APIs, database, binary data, whatever you want to pull from there, right? There's a couple of benefits and drawbacks. The benefit is you do not need additional hardware. You're putting that collector in the hardware you already have, and no need for additional hardware. You can also use automation. We can work with Chef or Puppet or some sort of scripting so that you can easily install these collectors as you spin up more machines out there. Now, the drawbacks or the cons around here is obviously those machines, those servers have to have outbound internet access. Otherwise, there's no way for that collector to connect to Sumo Logic as well. And the last one is there is some resource usage on that target host. So that target will have a collector, and although it's minimal, there is some usage But more than the usage is the fact that you do have to administer it and maintain it to a certain degree, right? You have to monitor it and keep an eye on it. So what are the typical scenarios? Who ends up using this local data collection? So most of our customers that have large amounts of very similar servers, they and perhaps they're using some sort of orchestration or automation, those are the ones who are using a lot of local data collection strategy in their environment. They might have some on-premise data centers, perhaps some cloud instances as well in there. Okay, what about centralized data collection? So remember, this is the case where you have you're using WMI or SSH to get the data to one central collector. What are the source types for that? Fairly similar: syslog stuff, operating system, middleware, custom apps, window events, so remote window events, and of course any scripting that you want to put together. So the benefits and the drawbacks here. The benefits is those machines, your actual hosts, do not need outbound internet access. They can just send data to that centralized host, which is already grabbing the data and sending it on. We would only encourage this scenario if you're already leveraging an existing logging infrastructure. Again, I think I mentioned it before, but if you do not have a login infrastructure already in place, something that is already centralizing your logs, we would not recommend that you embark in a whole process to do that just for the purposes of gathering logs for Sumo. It is expensive. It requires an administrator, perhaps even a head count, if not a half of a head count. It requires maintenance. You have to set up some syslog rules. You have to set up some failover. So there's an amount of complexity that goes with it, right? In addition to the fact that you will need some dedicated hardware. Now all of a sudden you need some sort of hardware to host that installed collector that can centralize all those logs. So just keep that in mind. If you already have an environment that is in place, that you can leverage, this is a good option. What we see, actually, before I say that, but typical scenarios is customers with mostly window environments or an existing login infrastructure use this scenario. What I will say is that what I see a lot with customers is they begin, if they have an existing login infrastructure, they'll probably start with local data collection with a few sources. Perhaps they want to get a few of their web servers to start generating, sending data to Sumo. They'll use some local data collection on those web servers, test the waters, make sure that that is what they want. And as they see that they can scale, if they're already using if they already have a login infrastructure, they'll switch over to a centralized data collection. Otherwise, they'll start moving into that automation using a chef or a puppet or some sort of scripting so that they can automate the deployment of these collectors across their multiple hosts as well. All right, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to continue. The last one I want to talk about is cloud data collection. And for cloud data collection, this is the what I was mentioning before, where you can just either set up a script and do straight up HTTPS posts over to Sumo. So things like Lambda scripts, Akamai, one login, log appender. You can send data over to us. You can do S3 buckets, so any data that is written to an S3 bucket can be sent. And then we have APIs for Google and for Office 365 as well. Couple of benefits. Obviously, the best one is there's absolutely no software installation. So it's pretty straightforward. You just tell us where it is, and we listen, and we can grab that data. There are some S3 latency issues. This is on the AWS side, and it's not a whole lot that we can do there. Just keep that in mind that if you're sending AWS data, there might be some latency issues with that. But the one that I do want to point you to, if you're considering a cloud-to-cloud data collection, is that with an HTTPS post, there is no caching that goes on. So you would have to do some caching on your end. If there is some network disconnect or whatever the case it might be, you will want to cache on your end so that you can recover and be able to resend some of that data. So it's just a straight up HTTP post, so there can't be any caching along the way or from our side. And oops, sorry about that. And typical scenarios that we see here is, well, any customer that is using a cloud infrastructure. But I will be fairly honest, and that's why we added this here, that while it is possible to rely completely on cloud data collection, that's not necessarily what we see. Not every custom, not all, most of our customers are not completely cloud data, 100% cloud data. So we see a mix of these three different options in here. So even though I talked about cloud data collection, I talked about centralized data collection and local data collection and their benefits, what we see at most customers is a mix of 2 or 3 of these, mainly because of what their sources look like. They might have some sources that, yes, they can do cloud-to-cloud collection, but they have a lot of sources that they will need some sort of centralized or local data collection sources from there. All right. So I see no questions with that. I would assume that's pretty straightforward. Before I move on to the metadata design, I'm just going to go into my instance. And by the way, I am using the new UI. If you notice, here is it says beta here, but this is the new UI. It's very similar to the old UI, except that things are over on the left-hand side. From a menu perspective, it's fairly similar. There's a few new things in the new UI, so I'd highly encourage you to move over to the new UI when you get a chance. For one, there is a home tab, and this home tab shows me the things that I have recently used, some recommended dashboards. It allows me to open a log search from here, a metrics analytics from here, Livetail, even the setup wizard, which is how I can easily get data into Sumo Logic as well. I'll show you that one in just 1 second, since we're talking about data collection. But before I forget, the other great benefit of this new UI is that we have a Learn tab. And through this Learn tab, there's a couple of tutorials, there's some videos, there's the ability to get to our docs, to get to our training and certification page, to check out our community as well. So I'll talk about this at the end, but by all means, when you get a chance, switch over to a new UI, check out the Home and the Learn tab for some of the benefits in there. All right, but what I did want to point out to you is, how do you find out, how do you get data into Sumo? Well, the easy way, or the way to do it, is you go to Manage and you go into Collection, and here is the page where you can start adding your collectors. This one that you see here is my training instance, and I have about 4 pages worth of collectors. In your case, this might be empty. But what I wanted to point out is, you notice here, I have some hosted collectors somewhere in there. Let me just type installed. Oops, install. You see here I have some installed collectors as well. So you're starting to see how I have some training collectors, some installed collectors, depending on the kind of data that I'm sending into Sumo. So a bit of a mix of the collectors that I have out there. The way that you would go about creating collectors is you click here, you say add a collector, and you notice it would ask me, do you want an installed collector, do you want a hosted collector? If I say an installed collector, what it would say is, okay, what are you going to install it on? Is it a Linux machine? Is it a Windows machine, Mac OS, Solaris? And you can just go and download the right collector, and it'll walk you through the process of installing a collector. If you're using a hosted collector, let's go back to add and say I did a hosted collector. All you have to do is specify a name and all that good stuff. And when you click save, it's going to give you a URL where you would do your HTTP post to. And it's as simple as getting that in place as well. All right. The other way of doing it is using this setup wizard. And the difference between clicking add collector and using the setup wizard is that the setup wizard is for very simple scenarios. What do I mean with that? Let me show you, for example, here's Apache Tomcat, or let's take this Artifactory request data. So here's the collector itself. And a collector could have multiple sources, as you see here. So let's take one of these sources, like Artifactory request. I'm going to click on Edit here for a second. And you see that after I install my collector, I can add a source to that collector. And this is an example of the source that I added. You can say the name, you can give it a source category. We'll talk about the source category in a second. This is a very, very important tag that you want to get it right. And then you have a few advanced options in here. If you build your if you create a source through the setup wizard, you will not have access to edit these advanced options as you're building it. You'll have access to them later on, as you see here. But in the setup itself, it's just very straightforward, and you don't have any of these advanced options. What are the advanced options? Things like enable time parsing. You want Sumo to just go and figure out what the time parsing is, or you can say, hey, I want you to ignore the time zone that it has. I want you to use this other time zone instead. Or you could even say, oh, Sumo, you're going to have a hard time understanding the time for the format that I'm sending you because it's a custom format. So let me specify that format for you. And here you can put the format itself. You can test it to see if it really works, and you can go that route as well. So this is all some of the advanced options that you have in there. Other advanced options that you have is if you're sending us messages that span multiple lines, then you can let Sumo Logic know that you want it to detect multiple lines. And Sumo is going to try its best to figure out what the multiple line message looks like. But if those, and you can say, hey, Sumo, just go and try to infer the boundaries, look for new lines or look for the logical things and try to find it. Or if Sumo is having a hard time because perhaps your messages are incredibly varied, there's a big variability in your messages, you can specify what that boundary looks like in regex so that Sumo knows that when it finds that pattern, that's the end of a message and it should start a new message from there. So you notice a few other advanced things that you can do. And the last advanced one that is in here is processing rules. And I'm just going to go here and add a rule to show you. You can create rules that say, I want Sumo to exclude messages that match this pattern, or I want from the messages that you're receiving through the source, I want to only include messages that match this particular pattern. And again, you can use regex in here to specify what that pattern should look like. And the last two that are in here is I want to hash this messages, meaning don't show me those things, or I want to mask messages or things in that message. Let's say you're sending me a credit card or a number or a medical record number or social security number. I might want to mask or hash those numbers depending on your need in there. All right, so I wanted to show you this just so that you know some of the advanced things that you can do when you're setting up your sources. But if you don't need to do any of those advanced things, then some of the easy ways that you can build your collectors is through the setup wizard. And if you notice, it can just upload a file pretty easily here, or you can set up some streaming service. And depending on what you choose, for example, if you were to choose, let's say, AWS CloudTrail, it knows that you want to do a cloud-to-cloud integration. So it says, okay, I'm going to give you this default source category name. You can change it. We'll talk a lot more about source category in a little bit. Give me your access key ID and your secret key so I know how to get to this bucket name and what path expression I should show. And then what region is that bucket in. And by the way, you will need to copy and paste this policy so that Sumo can go and get this data from Sumo. And we have here some instructions on how to do it. This show me how shows you exactly how to go to the AWS console and be able to add this. And if you click continue, this creates the collector and the source to go get your AWS CloudTrail from these details that you specified in here. All right. Similarly, if you had gone in here and said, I want to set up streaming data for Apache, then it knows that you're probably going to use a collector because you can't do a cloud-to-cloud integration from Apache. So it says, all right, do you want to do an existing collector or do you want to do a new collector? If you chose a new collector, it's going to say what operating system, it's going to install that and all that good stuff for you. So again, two ways of installing your collectors. Go to Add Collector or Setup Wizard, depending on the complexity of what you're going to be doing within Sumo. All right, with that said, let me go back in here and let's talk a little bit about metadata. You heard me talk about source category a couple of times. The reason for that is because every single message that gets brought into Sumo gets, gets stamped with at least these 5 metadata tags. The name of the collector where the data came from, and you can choose whatever name you want, but keep in mind that if you don't choose a name, it's just going to default to the host name. The source, which is where the data came from. For example, is it Apache Access or is it Apache data, Apache error data, right? The source host. So again, it defaults to the host name, but you can change it if you want to. The source name, which is the name and the path of the log file. So you can even search through your logs looking for the name and the path of the log file if that's what you know. And then there's something called the source category. And this is pretty interesting because it can be freely configured. It can be anything that you want. So because it can be anything that you want, we have some recommendations of what we think you should use to make it a lot easier on yourselves and on your users. And that's what I want to go into, and it's in this next couple of slides. What we recommend from a source category perspective is to use a naming convention that is something like component 1 / component 2 / component 3 till however many levels you want. We recommend between 3 and 5 levels. Something more than that will be just getting a little harder to manage. And what you want to do is you want to go from least descriptive to most descriptive. So here's some examples of what you could do. You could have prod / my app1 / Apache access, prod my app1 Apache error, prod my app1. Perhaps you could have AWS / CloudTrail as well, if you wanted to just group everything that's CloudTrail. Similar to that one, you could have prod my app2 Nginx access, prod my app2 Tomcat Catalina. So you notice how you could have these slashes, in this case, broken by app. Notice that initially it's broken by prod because we're assuming that you probably have some dev data in there as well. So you can then say dev / and then the same as you had in here. One thing to note is that not all source categories need to have the same amount of levels. For example, this one here, which is pretty long, but I just added it for kicks as an example, has 5 levels versus this one here that only has 3 levels as well. So it doesn't have to be the same number of levels. By the way, here is a good blog for you guys to check out. It's called Good Source Category, Bad Source Category. It's easy to talk about what a good thing should look like, but when you see a bad example, it brings it home. You're kind of like, oh yeah, okay, I see what you mean with that. So when you get a chance, take a peek at that as well. All right, why are we suggesting this kind of source category? Well, the cool thing is because you can use wildcards. So this makes it a lot easier for searching. So if I say, in my search, if I say source category equals prod / my app / Apache star, then that means I'm going to get all my Apaches, whether it is Apache access or whether it is Apache error. I'm going to grab all those log files as well. If I said source category equals star my app Apache, that means I'm going to grab all my Apache logs, both from my prod and from my dev environments, and it's going to be the Apache access and the Apache error files as well. So I'm grabbing everything for that my app instance. If I had starred the my app, then I would grab it for both apps as well. So you start seeing how using a good naming convention can make the searching for your users a lot easier as well. Also, later on, you will see, I'll talk about creating partitions. Think of partitions of just indexing your data, putting your data in different indexes or different buckets so that they're easily found by the different groups of people that you want. So you can create a bucket that is source category equals prod my app1. That means all the data for app1 is going to go in one bucket, whereas all the data for app2 is going to go in a separate bucket in this example in here. So creating indexes that move data to different places allows you to have users not search 100% of your data, but instead, in this example, you're probably breaking it into 50-50. So when someone runs a search, the search is going to be much quicker because it's really looking at only looking at through 50% of that data instead of 100% of that data. Okay, and then the last one here, we also have role-based access control roles. So if you want to limit certain roles to only be able to see some type of data. For example, you want a role to not be able to see data for the second app, for my app2. You could do something like source category equals prod my app1, and that means you're only giving that role access to that kind of data itself. So again, creating a source category that is meaningful right off the start is going to make it a lot easier for you down the road. All right. So what are some of the common components that we've seen across customers for these things? Most of our customers, I would say 80% of our customers, use something along these lines. Environment, so prod, dev, UAT. the name of the app, some geographic information, for example, the AWS region, and some sort of business unit naming in there. So here's a good example of how it could be set up. Prod web Apache Access, dev web Apache Access, prod db MySQL error, and dev db MySQL error. However, if you find, this is if you want to break, if it's really important for you to break your data or search your data between prod and dev. But if that's not all that important and what you really care for is to separate your data between, like, say, web and database, then you can put these at the end. You can do web Apache Access, prod, web Apache Access, dev. So you're still breaking the data up by production and development, but that probably is not the most important thing for you. Again, no answer is better than the other. I should say no answer is incorrect. It all depends on what your data looks like in order to choose these source categories for you. All right, I see no questions, so let me just move on to, I've talked a lot about ingesting logs and how to get that log data into Sumo. One of the things that you also, that we've also talked about is metrics. And for metrics, there's 3 ways that you can get data, metric data into Sumo. One of them is host metrics. And by the way, these links are to webinars on how to set up and get that data into Sumo, so I won't go into detail. I'll show you in a second a little graph of the landscape for metrics. But basically, you can get host metrics from any of your servers, so things like CPU, things like network or TCP/IP information. You can get that kind of those host metrics from your servers. You can get AWS metrics. So what Amazon Web Services does is it gathers its metrics and then it sends them on to AWS CloudWatch. So we can then go into CloudWatch and grab those AWS metrics into Sumo itself. And the third way that we can get metrics is any metrics that are graphite format or graphite compatible, for example, CollectD or DropWizard, we can go grab those metrics and bring them into Sumo as well. Again, here are links to webinars on how to grab that data and bring it into Sumo. From a metrics perspective, the landscape looks a little bit like this. Let's do the simplest one first. If you're sending, if you want to grab the AWS metrics, we can get them from CloudWatch, and if you notice, if I go in here, if I go into my instance and I use the setup wizard and I tell it that I want to grab AWS metrics, whatever that is. What did I just do here? Here we go, AWS CloudWatch metrics. Again, I would just specify the access key, the access ID, and then I could just specify which metrics I want to get. Am I getting the AWS EC2 metrics, the CloudFront metrics, the ELB metrics, whatever metrics I want to grab from here, or if I happen to have some custom namespaces, I can define them in here as well to grab those metrics from there. You would specify again the regions, copy this in your AWS console to make sure we have access to it, and you would be able to start pulling in your AWS metrics. Okay, so that was the easy one, getting metrics from CloudWatch. The second one is CollectD or your OS. I should say metric libraries or CollectD can send metrics straight up to a collector and then on to Sumo Logic. That collector can act as doing double duty in grabbing host metrics from your host. So this number 2 here is your host metrics. CollectD and metrics libraries can be used in Graphite. Now, if you're using StatsD, then you would, as you probably have in your environment already, you would be sending your data over to your StatsD server, which does a little bit of aggregation and a little bit of throttling, if you will. But then from your StatsD server, you can send your data onto a collector in Graphite format, which then sends it on to Sumo Logic. So your landscape would look something like this. All right, so I've talked a lot about collection. I don't see any questions. I think it's fairly straightforward. You can go and start adding your collectors. You will have so the steps to do it are pretty straightforward. The first one is you add your collector through there. Once you add your collector, it will show up in here, like say this one, or let me just grab, let's say this one here. That's one. Anyway, any of these. And then once you have your collector set up, you can start adding sources to those collectors. So if I click here and I add a source, in this case, because it's a hosted collector, it says, okay, what kind of source do you want? Are you sending CloudTrail data or Amazon data, or are you doing an HTTP post? Are you doing Cloud Syslog? What kind of data are you sending in here? If you were looking at an installed collector, let me just look for an installed collector here. Let's just grab this training server one. And you said add a source, then it asks you, okay, are you doing a local file? Are you doing a remote file? Is it a syslog, Docker logs? What kind of stuff are you sending? Or are you sending us host metrics since it's an installed collector, right? So it's smart enough to figure out where you are and what kind of stuff you might be wanting to send over to us. All right, so let's get back in here. Setting up your collectors, pretty straightforward. Let's talk now somewhat a little more advanced tools, but something that you definitely need to keep in mind as you start getting more and more users in your environment. I want to talk about 3 optimization tools. One of them, two of them you probably will be using later on, but one of them is something that you might want to start using right away. So the 3 optimization tools I want to talk about, I thought I had a screen showing all 3. I don't, but that's okay because I have them all here. It's partitions, field extraction rules, and schedule views. Let me begin with field extraction rules because this is the one that you probably want to start doing right away. So what are field extraction rules? Like the name suggests, what it allows you to do is it allows you to parse your data, and it allows you to extract fields that are meaningful to your users. So if you guys remember, for those of you who attended other webinars, you probably saw that you could do things like, let me just go grab a quick query here. I'm just going to do a quick search on my Apache Access data. You notice that I'm going to search this, and I'm going to extract this IP. Oops, I'm going to just extract this IP address from this query here. I don't know why it's highlighting something funky. I'm just going to extract this IP address and call it IP address. Okay. All right, so what it did is it created a parse statement, and I can run this query, and now you'll notice that I have my message like I had before, but that IP address has been extracted for me. So if you think that every single user in your organization is going to be needing that IP address, then it'd be great if they don't have to do this step. It'd be great if they just have that IP address already available to them so that they can count by IP address or compare the size of the data they're receiving by IP address or whatnot, right? So what we're going to do, what I'm going to show you is how to create field extraction rules that allow you to do this parsing as the data is coming into. As the data is getting ingested into Sumo, that's when you parse all these fields through a field extraction rule. So to do that, you go into settings, and here you have something called a field extraction rule. You click the plus sign and you say, I'm going to create an Apache Access rule. And the scope is anytime you get data that matches source category equals, and here you could do something like star Apache Access. Why? Because you would want to parse both your prod and your dev data. Or if your prod and your dev data look different, then you can create one for prod. So this might be my prod Apache Access, and I could have a different dev Apache Access field extraction rule as well. And then you can specify the path expression. So you could knock yourself silly here writing your expression, or we have templates for things that we already know what they look like. So because Apache data is pretty standard, we can get you the regex for that. If you need to edit these, you can do so. You can add whatever you want in here. Maybe have extra fields that you've added to your logs. So this is how a field extraction was created. I'll show you that I already had one for for Apache Access. It's already extracted those fields. How would my user know about that? Because if you notice, I'm just going to run a quick query here with nothing, no parsing. Over here, let me just get some real estate. Over here on the left-hand side, we have what we call the field browser, and here are all the fields that have already been parsed for me. There's status code, there's source IP, there's URL, there's all these fields, so I don't have to parse them again. As a user, I can just say something like count by status code because status code has already been parsed as a field, and I can just use it to start doing my analytics in here. All right, so field extraction rules are incredibly important. For you as an administrator, it's going to give you better performance. Every query is not having to parse anymore, but instead you can just start using the data that is in there. You're going to have some standardized field names, so people are not going to call a field status, whereas others call it status code and others call it status field. You're going to have the same names, and it's going to be much easier. Your searches are now much more simplified because you don't have big parsing statements in there. When you're building your rules, build them simple. Make very specific rules. Don't try to make complex rules because they get harder to maintain. You might build them, but someone else is maintaining them, and it's going to be harder for them to know what you built in there. Try parsing your fields. Parse them. Build your rules. Build your parse statements in here and test them thoroughly. And only once you feel like you're comfortable with it, do you want to then move on to create the field extraction rule from it. There is a limitation, however. There's a limitation of 50 rules or 200 fields, whichever you hit first. This will be removed soon. I wouldn't worry too much. I don't think we have any customers that have reached this. If you feel like you're reaching any of these limits, let us know. Open a support ticket, and we can certainly help you with those fields as well. And the other one is not all operators are supported in the field extraction rules. For example, the JSON operator is supported, meaning that if you're sending us data in JSON format, you can use a JSON operator. But there is a version of the JSON operator that is called JSON Auto that allows you to parse everything on that JSON file or JSON message. That one is not supported yet, in part because we have a limit in the number of rules that exist in Sumo. Okay, so that's the first one that I want to talk about, field extraction rules. The second one I want to talk about is partitions. And as I mentioned before, partitions are a way to bucket your data, to put your data into small buckets so that when you're running searches in your data, you don't have to search across 100% of your data, but instead you can segregate your data and just search for smaller chunks. So for example, you can create a bucket with the following definition. You could create a bucket called prod, or prod app1, that has a source category equals prod/myapp1 star, which means all the data that is for your production app1 is going to go in that bucket. All data that is for production app2 is going to go in this other bucket. And all other data, meaning all data that is not prod or that might be for app3 or app4 or app5, those are going to go in the default bucket. So let me just show you that UI for it. I'm going to go back here, and again I'm going to go into settings. And under settings, there's something called partitions. And if you see in partitions, I might have some sample ones here. Yeah, here's some samples. So look at this one. This one's called My App 1. And it has, let me just edit it so you can see how it was put together. It's pretty straightforward. Oops, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to just view details. Sure. Anyway, I think this does the trick. Essentially, it's just saying anything that matches source category equals prod my app 1 star should go into this index called my app 1. So how do you search that? In this case, you would just say index equals my app 1. And in that case, from there you could say, and only the things that match the word error. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm searching for errors only in the bucket called my app 1, which will make my query so much faster because, it will make my query so much faster because it's searching only that particular index and it doesn't have to search anything else through that. By the way, in the back end, we have something called query rewriting. So if you had, let me just comment this out for just a second. If you had built your query like this, source category, source category equals, what was it? Prod my app 1 star and error. let's say that you had built a query like that, and you already had your partition in place, and you build a query like this. Sumo Logic is smart enough that it's going to say, hey, wait, this matches exactly the index that you built. So what it's going to do is it's going to rewrite this query to this over here that we had before. It's going to rewrite the query for you in the backend, and it's really going to send this query, which is going to be a lot more performant, and then it's going to come back with results. So in the background, Sumo is already doing a lot of magic, a lot of rewriting and magic to try to get those queries and take advantage of all your partitions that are in place. So a couple of best practices. The first thing is we suggest absolutely no overlap in your source categories. So you don't want to have prod my app 1 star and then prod my app 1 / Apache star, because then messages that are for Apache prod app 1 are going to go in that bucket and they're going to go in the second bucket as well. So try to avoid overlaps as much as you can. Sumo Logic will deduct those messages. So when you run a query, it's not going to return both. It's going to be smart enough and look and say, hey, this message is here twice. We're not going to count it. But it's just extra time for you as you're returning your searches. And you also get billed for storing that message twice. Because if you remember, storage is one of the ways that we bill you. So you don't want to have overlaps. Second thing is, try not to have too many partitions. Anything above 20 partitions, it's probably too many partitions. If you have 20 partitions, you're forcing Sumo to kind of try to go figure out what partition it should be looking into. Ideally, you don't want to have more than 30% of your data in one of the partitions. Otherwise, if you have one partition that has 80% of your data, it's almost like not having a partition, right? So what you want to have is not too small, but not too big either. Right, between 1 and 30% of your total volume per partition. And then here is the key. What makes sense to create a partition? You want to group the data that is normally searched together most often. So if you search your data by prod versus dev, then this makes sense. But if you search your data by app 1 versus app 2, then this upper one example might make better sense for you. Again, there's pointers to documentation if you want to find a little bit more information on that. All right, the last one I'm going to talk about is scheduled views. And from a scheduled views perspective, think of a scheduled view as very similar to the database materialized view. The idea behind it is if you're searching data that you regularly aggregate and that you would aggregate on a regular basis, what you can do is you can pre-aggregate that data in a scheduled view. So pre-aggregating data so that you can then do long-term analysis on that data. For example, let's say that you're going to run a query for the last 90 days on a regular basis. What you would want to do is just aggregate that data into that view, which happens every minute. It just gets aggregated, and then when you run your query, you can just go and grab the data from it. It allows you so finding the needle in the haystack usually requires, give me a lot of data, and then I'm going to go search for this one thing. That's when you want to use this pre-aggregated views. We recommend that the selectivity is 1 to 10,000. So if it's not very selective, it might not necessarily be a good use case for a scheduled view. It's just duplicating data. And then how does it work? A scheduled view tends to be updated about once a minute. It does allow backfilling. So you can say, I want my scheduled view to go as far back as your data retention. If your data is retained for 90 days, you can create a scheduled view all the way back to your 90 days. And how do you search it? If you have a view, then you would say _view equals, and then you would specify what your view is. Let's say that you have a view called Artifactory, and then you can go and search your results from that view itself. So you notice here, I have a view that is pulling only certain types of messages that I've already pre-selected in my view itself. Okay, so I'm not pulling the entire Artifactory data, for example. And one of the things I do want to point out is that scheduled views do I hate saying the word duplicate because they don't do one-to-one. It doesn't fully duplicate the data, but it does create more data. Schedule view does create more data, and that does count against your ingest volume. It's minimal, but I still have to let you know that schedule views do count towards your ingest volume that you're built for. All right. So in review, I've talked about 3 options. I've talked about field extraction rules, schedule views, and partitions. When do you use which one? Because it seems like there's a lot of these different cases. So if you want to do the following, here's the different options that you're going to use. If you want to extract fields from logs so that all users can use your logs, then you use a field extraction view. If you want to do long-term trends, you want to start identifying these long-term trends, and it's taking a long time, then you probably benefit from using some of these schedule views. If you want to segregate your data, you want to start using partitions. If you want pre-computed or aggregated data, you want to use the schedule views. And for role-based access control, if you want to deny or grant access to some roles, you can use either partitions, or you can even use schedule views. You can create schedule views and just give users access to those views as well. Meaning, here's the aggregated data, but you don't have access to the fine-grained details of that data as well. All right, I've talked a lot. And told you a lot of things here. You can ingest any types of logs, whether structured or unstructured. You can ingest metrics into Sumo with those 3 different options that we talked about. There's different ways that you can deploy your sources, but again, it's going to depend on your topography and what you have in place. I will say that a mix of those is probably going to be the most common scenario. You definitely want to develop a robust naming convention. If you don't have one, now is the time to go fix it. The reason I say that is because the more you wait, the more your users will get used to whatever convention you already have in place. So if you need to fix it soon so that you can benefit from that. And you also want to start taking advantage of optimization tools, in particular field extraction rules. So with this summary, I'm going to have a call to action. What are the things that you should be doing right away? First one is, for your deployment options, figure out what's the best one that fits your environment. For your source categories, take a quick look at them, and if it doesn't make sense what you have, you want to come up with a good naming convention that works for your team. And the last one is field extraction rules. Get those in place, make it a lot easier for your users to start taking advantage of your data in there. Okay, that's my story. I'm going to stick to it, guys. Any questions from the audience? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the recording for now, since people don't ask questions usually when we're still recording. Let me stop it here